This is a review of the 1974 John Barry film Claudine. That's Barry with an E, not the composer, but a little-known director named John Barry. I'll talk a little bit more about him in a second. This movie stars the legendary James Earl Jones and the legendary Diane Carroll. Overall, Claudine is, I think, a great movie. A lost American classic. Nonetheless, it's rated 7.3 on IMDb with 2,000 votes, which is lunacy. One of the most bizarre IMDb ratings I've seen so far on any of the movies in this channel. This is a phenomenal movie. Like I said, a lost American classic. Claudine is from the 70s, and it's sort of in a context of Blaxploitation. I talk about Blaxploitation films in some depth in my review of The Spook Who Sat by the Door. Very interesting movie. You should go check out that video. Basically, Blaxploitation can mean different things to different people, and it can be controversial because despite maybe telling new stories, new black stories for the first time on screen, these films were not politically correct. They were over the top, hyper-stylized, sort of inner-city stories that may have been exploiting both the people they were intended to get into the theaters as well as the people making the movies. So it's sometimes a dirty word, sometimes a badge of honor, depending on who you ask. Probably more the former, to call something a Blaxploitation film. This is in the context of Blaxploitation, as in the time and the place, and certainly the prevalence of some of those movies opened the door, created an opportunity for this movie to be made. But for the most part, this is almost certainly not a Blaxploitation film, at least in my opinion. But like I said, we're maybe splitting hairs here, and does the label matter so much? Well, maybe not. Go watch the movie, and then you'll know exactly what it is and what it's about, and what a movie it is. One housekeeping thing, I guess, to some extent, John Barry, the director of this film, was not black, and sometimes with these movies you find yourself doing a bunch of calculations, filling out a scorecard before you watch the thing to figure out whether or not you're allowed to like it. For instance, and this is significant, this is highly significant, I think, for a lot of movies in this era, and maybe movies now too. Plenty of Blaxploitation films were, maybe had black actors in them, but were produced and directed by white filmmakers and white studios and such, and that's one of the places where exploitation comes into play. And so to some extent, it does make sense to sort of keep score a little bit, I guess. But on the other hand, you might say, hold on, that doesn't have anything to do with the movie. Surely you should just watch the movie. And I think both are important. And in this case, watching the movie, I think, basically tells you what you need to know. This is a white director. I'm not really a fan of that, but this is in a hugely different category than what is mostly called Blaxploitation, I think, for a number of reasons that I'll maybe touch on. John Barry, though, is an interesting director, so I figured I'd mention him. John Barry was blacklisted in the 50s. He's not very well known and had a very stunted Hollywood career because he was named by Edward Dmytryk, I think, as a communist. He was a communist. He had registered with the Communist Party at some point, I think, during the Spanish-American War. And being blacklisted in Hollywood caused Barry to go into exile, essentially, self-exile, in Europe, and it basically ended his Hollywood career, although Claudine was made after this once he got back. Still, John Barry's works are sort of few and far between. I had not heard of any other of movies that he had made, largely because of this blacklisting debacle. John Barry is from New York, where this movie is set. I should also mention that this movie is set not too far away from where I live. So I may have a personal connection to this, but I don't think that's the reason why I appreciate and enjoy this movie. Okay, what is this movie, Claudine? Well, this is a movie, basically a love story and a family movie, about Claudine, a woman who has 6 children, big family, single mother living in Harlem, who is on welfare, but also sort of secretly has some sort of job as a housekeeper in a much wealthier neighborhood. And James Earl Jones, who's a garbage man who fancies Claudine. And that's really all you need to know. For the most part, this is not a movie that I need to dig deeply into to figure out, why you should watch it or why it might be interesting. You should just go watch this movie. It's a great, great movie. But I do have a little bit more to say than that. Like I said, this movie, in some ways, is not really the kind of movie that I usually watch or review, because this is, to some degree, a likable family movie, to some degree, an uplifting movie. At the same time, there's an important balance here with a serious movie and a political movie. Diane Carroll was sort of a groundbreaking actress for a number of different reasons, but one of the things she was involved in was a television show called Julia that was one of the first television shows centering on a black characters. It was a sitcom, had no laugh track, interestingly, that didn't put them in tough inner city environments. That wasn't essentially a documentary, but was basically very light sitcom-y fare, but with a black family. To some extent, maybe the Cosbys are something like this, although I really don't know anything about that. But I guess that's groundbreaking in some ways. This show was also widely criticized at the time, I think mainly by the black community, because it wasn't really political. Julia in the television show was a single mother. She had one son. She was sort of a upper middle class, fairly well off character. She worked, I forget exactly what her job was, what her role was, but she worked at some sort of upscale scientific company doing something or other, and had a relatively comfortable lifestyle. And there was no father figure in the television show, which was a big issue for a lot of people. It seemed like some sort of form of castration, which is something mentioned a number of times in Claudine, was the idea that there was no father, because if there had been a father figure, a role model of black masculinity, that would have been more challenging for the network, a harder sell, something like that. So Julia was sort of a light comedy family sort of sitcom thing that did not strike a balance with serious issues and with the political. Claudine, on the other hand, does strike a balance. Now, it's possible that not everyone in the world is going to be happy with that balance. Some people will want this to be a completely serious and a completely political movie. If that's what you want, maybe you go watch The Spook Who Sat by the Door. That's not what this movie is. This movie, I've said it a couple of times now, I just got the feeling it's a classic movie. This is a nostalgic movie, a movie with endearing characters that will really stay with you, with endearing lines, and such. A movie that's sort of meant to be remembered. You know what I mean? A movie that's sort of meant to get lodged up here to some degrees. A classic movie. It sort of kind of reminds me of kind of the ups and downs of something like Forrest Gump or something like that. This movie, I say it's sort of a family movie. That doesn't mean it's all ups. It doesn't mean it's all uplifting. There are a lot of serious challenges in that. Now, I said it's a political movie. Let me be a little bit more specific. To some degree, the politics in this movie are slightly vague. For the most part, the welfare office and one social worker in particular serves as a proxy for a more general sort of economic and governmental oppression that's going on here. And in some ways, that's not the most complex thing in the world, but I think they actually do a really good job of using this to give you a fairly accessible idea about how the system might be rigged against people, living in Harlem. And there's another aspect of this film as well, which is one of the family members, the oldest son, Claudine's oldest son, Charles is his name, becomes sort of involved in political activism, joining some sort of Black Panthers-like organization. It's never explicitly said where he is, but something along those lines, and asking difficult questions, asking questions to James Earl Jones' character. Roop is the character, Rupert Marshall, but Roop for short, asking him tough questions. His mother doesn't want him to be a part of this, doesn't want him to take a risk, doesn't want him to, says maybe that he's asking for trouble or something like that. And there's, I guess, sort of a bit of a generational thing or something like this. Charles doesn't understand how you can sit by. There's some great scenes regarding this and some interesting twists that I won't get into. What I will say is that when you are introduced to this Charles subplot, it seems at first as if their movie's going to treat it like he is a sort of rebellious youngster going through a phase to some degree. But as the movie goes on, they actually give his perspective much more space than you might initially expect. He asks some questions, like I said, that James Earl Jones, that Roop can't answer. He poses some questions and some thoughts that are almost certainly true and valuable. Like I said, there's a bit of a narrative of castration here, and he finds his development of his masculinity to be fundamentally curtailed by the circumstances of his life. And, like I said, he asks some difficult questions there that the movie really gives space to and does not shy away from. So while this is sort of a family movie in some ways, and it's, I think, maybe even called a comedy by some people, and has some really funny moments, some endearing moments, it also goes all in, I think. Not exactly all in, but it goes... It does enough. It does quite a bit to show you the political, maybe not in its full complexity, but certainly gives you an idea. One of the things that I think is most striking about the film is that it shows a disjoint world. It shows a system a system in the wider world, a system in the rest of the city, the white system, and it shows the black system and the black way that things happen and such, and how those two things, are disjoint. That's the movie for all of its likability. I think is pretty powerful, and that's I can't say enough how much I like this movie. Now, because this is overall just an overwhelmingly positive review, let me dig deep, try and find a couple of things that I didn't like so much about the movie. Nitpicking. But I'll give it a little bit. I should mention, too, before we get to that, I should mention that the music in this movie is really, really great. So Gladys Knight and the Pips perform the music, but I think most of it was written by Curtis Mayfield. So all-star cast there doing the music, which ends up being really great. The style in this film is really nice, definitely influenced maybe by some of the experimental style of blaxploitation films or of early 70s films. More generally, it's a couple of interesting sort of scenes with parallel editing, like at the end and such. A really good mixture of some slightly edgy, slick things with incredibly natural editing and framing. Really nice. Right. I was attempting to criticize this movie. I do think the end, to some degree, is slightly rushed. The sort of last maybe 10 minutes of the film, there's maybe a big issue that's raised, and then it's resolved a little bit quickly and maybe easily. Not too bad, but maybe slightly rushed, I guess. The very end, like the penultimate scene, is maybe slightly ambiguous. I think it's clear what's going on. I think it's not a problem, but like I said, I'm digging for something I don't like about this movie. Another thing you might notice is that the movie does try to focus to some degree on some of the children, some of Claudine's children, and little subplots that go on there. And those might feel like the movie is starting to spread itself thin, a little too thin at some points. Those aren't fully developed, but they're there. And I think, to be honest, it feels balanced. And really, the relationships with the children in this movie are one of the strong points. At times, the household is completely out of control. At times, Claudine is treated by her children like another kid. They're not exactly polite all the time, but at the same time, there are some profound moments of love within the family that make this just a home run of a family movie in a lot of ways. And so really, I think that family aspect of it is great. There's maybe one scene in the movie that I thought, why exactly? That shows one of the kids. But as the scene goes on, it's actually revealed exactly why it's there, and it ends up making perfect sense. So I'm struggling even to find something I don't really like about this movie. Like I said, perhaps it's not the usual type of thing that I review here. It is not the most subtle movie in the whole world, but like I said, it seems to strike a really good balance, at least for me, between being an endearing movie with really strong characters. This is, I think, one of the main things that differentiates it from most blaxploitation films, is that these are characters, streetwise characters to some degree, but not over-the-top characters or anything like that. They are characters that you can look up to some degree or something. They're strong, positive characters for the most part, still realistic to some degree. There's still moments of both Claudine and Roop losing control to some degree, but a far cry from the sort of deeply cynical, hugely stereotypical, over-the-top characters in most blaxploitation films. These are just polar opposites. These are, like I said, endearing characters that will last. I should also mention, even though it's totally obvious, that Diane Carroll and James Earl Jones completely hit it out of the park with acting in this movie. Diane Carroll was nominated for an Academy Award for this. James Earl Jones, legendary actor on stage and screen. Both just incredible in this movie. All the kids also hit it out of the park. All the incidental characters are great. Like I said, I can't do much more than simply praise this movie, Claudine. I strongly recommend that you should check it out. Like I said, it's a classic movie, but it's one nobody knows about. It's no secret why that might be, but I think together maybe we can generate maybe like 1-2 more views for this great movie, Claudine, from 1974.